The podcast host problem. A podcast usually has a host and then one guest or many guests. Often there are also multiple hosts. Now, what is the podcast host problem? The thing is this: the audience already knows the host. The host, if now not on a trajectory that is basically outpacing the audiences or the average audience members by a high basically margin, one could say. So one could take the first derivative of one's level. This could be any level, this could be athletics, this could be how much money you're making, this could be how much books you're reading, or I don't know. And the first derivative is then basically the incline of an previously absolute level. Now, let's just say this is speed. And now the first thing would be that you move in space. The second thing then would be the speed itself. And now if you have additionally an incline basically in the speed, an increase in the speed, then you basically are accelerating. So if the host is not accelerating kind of faster compared to somebody else, or somebody else might have even the same speed, then the problem is eventually the host will be boring. Now, this is kind of the plain resolution of this. If now the host is boring, then there is this new thing, which is the guest. Now, the guest comes on, and most podcasts, at least these days, at least the podcasts where there are people interviewed, which is kind of what we are now knowing as podcast, even though Andrew Huberman also makes his solo episodes and calls them also a podcast. And he also has a microphone, which is also kind of podcasty. So, what I'm trying to say here is, first of all, the host, with more exposure to the audience, becomes more and more stale. The guest is always the new thing. So eventually, the thing that the audience, and this is something that I want from many hosts of podcasts I listen to them not necessarily because of the host. I mean, in the beginning, the host might have been a little interesting, but I already know so many things about the host because the host is in every episode basically the counterpart of the novel guest. Now, if the novel guest is here, what I actually then want, because I already know the host, is for the host to just ask the questions and maybe also provide some interaction, and maybe there is also this interaction between somebody I already know, and how does this guest, which I already have seen on another podcast, now interact with this person, and there is also the kind of the social dynamics of the situation. Nonetheless, if I'm not that interested in the host any longer, and with ongoing watching, so with an increasing number of episodes of a podcast listened to or watched, I am probably less interested, I as an audience member, I just use the first person now, am probably less interested in the podcast host. So as then the guest comes on and the host then tells me about his new dog and about something else and about something else, and instead of just the guest says something and then the host is like, yeah, that's just like in my life where I also had these and these things, then I am, but also maybe the audience to a certain extent might wish that the host just does that. Basically the proportion of speaking is more towards the guest and less towards the host, and this then is kind of the podcast host problem. Now, if you then have a podcast and you are a host and you also have kind of an urge to tell maybe people about the things you are experiencing or you do in your life, then the problem is the fundamental thing, or this fundamental thing, which is that the audience you would be targeting with basically you telling people about yourself is a different audience probably compared to the one you already have on your established podcasts, because the audience of the current podcast you have is then the audience is the audience that is interested in all of the different guests plus your hosting to a certain extent. But often I find myself, for example, listening to a new podcast because there is a guest I would like to see, or I would like to see. For example, I've listened to a book and then I search for the author of this book and then he appears on this podcast. I don't really care about the host. Maybe I am exposed to the host for the first time. Maybe the host is particularly smart, particularly funny, particularly anything. And I also then might be interested in the host. But the host and his show have probably a different audience compared to the host alone. Andrew Huberman here kind of might be the exception, where he might have kind of similar audiences. But what I also found on my own podcast listening experience with Andrew Huberman is that I actually in the beginning came for Andrew Huberman, and then there were all these episodes, and these episodes in my experience diluted kind of the utility of the podcast up until the point where I found myself kind of forced listening to all of the episodes because I made the point of listening to all of the Huberman Lab episodes, but often there were guests where I just was not that interested, and since Huberman was less and less involved basically and just was interacting as the host, I then eventually kind of now just don't listen to the Huberman podcast any longer, even though I listened to it so intensely for the last couple of years. Now, back to the host problem. There might also be kind of a status thing or multiple different variables that might come along with something like this. If I am the host, then I have this podcast which has so many subscribers, which has so many views, but to a certain extent, one could say that these people are not interested in me so much, but rather in the guests I have on. And so there might also be, I basically would play almost always kind of the part of the one that is just asking the questions, and I also kind of have to do this because I also am the host. But if I now want to also bring myself out into the world, then the podcast itself or the audience of the podcast might kind of be disappointed or might not expect something like this. So therefore one would have to create another vehicle, another brand, another channel for making kind of just the content that is based then on me, the host. But then, because the guests probably have a little bit more interest compared to the host, maybe at least, because the guests are always new, and nobody probably can be the kind of the average of all of these different guests, which have to probably succeed a certain interest threshold for the guests to be accepted and invited onto shows. So by design, the average interest of a guest is always higher compared to the host. So therefore, if I now am a host and I want to create kind of my own channel where I talk about the things I am experiencing, then I also have the risk of, now if I do this, then compared to the podcast, which has 2 million subscribers and my videos get 3 views per video, then this also is a risk, and not only a risk but also kind of a business decision, because this might negatively affect and be associated then with my podcast, and also then might lower my status because these guests have thought that I am this big deal. But in reality, if I make videos on my own and not am just asking questions for important people, then maybe not everybody that listens to the podcast is interested.